Okay, we're going to get started now. So thank you everybody for joining us today and for being a part of the Tribal Climate Health Project Advisory Group. We appreciate your participation. So the purpose of today's meeting will be to provide first of all, we're going to provide a brief project update. The main focus of today's call and meeting is going to be providing a high-level overview of the training curriculum outline and obtaining your feedback on this outline. To close out the meeting, we will discuss next steps, including a more detailed review and feedback opportunities. So before kind of diving in, I want to run through several housekeeping items. First of all, we want to keep everybody muted unless you're speaking. So try not to, you have control over muting and unmuting yourself. So please try to keep yourself muted so we don't pick up background noise when you aren't speaking. We'll be doing introductions in just a moment. However, we ask that you introduce yourself or remind us of your name and who you are before you begin speaking at any time after we do introductions. To avoid having people talk over one another, I'm asking that people please use the GoToMeeting app to raise your hand. There is an option to raise your hand next to your, I believe there's an option on the app to raise your hand, and I'll be monitoring for raised hands and calling upon people. Before moving on, after one section, we'll be sure to ask if there are any more questions, and if you were raising your hand and weren't called upon, feel free to speak at that time. We do have limited time. We only have an hour for this. We only scheduled an hour. And we're going to end promptly at after an hour. So please keep your comments very brief as we are going through this and getting your feedback. This is going to allow as many people to speak as possible. I encourage you to ask questions and provide comments through the chat window that is in the GoToMeeting app on your screen. There will be plenty of opportunities to provide more detailed feedback following the meeting. So as I mentioned, there's a chat function. You can find that in the GoToMeeting app. You may have seen me add a message already. I also did send a message already. You may not have received it if you arrived after the message. But for best audio, you may want to call in. Sometimes when you're streaming, you won't get quite as good audio, and there should be instructions. There should be a number and an access number, as well as an audio pin under the audio tab on the GoToMeeting app. If you are showing up in the attendees list as waiting for name, please do enter your name and email address. We want to keep track of who's attending and be able to follow up with anybody afterwards, especially if we receive comments from somebody and we don't know who exactly it was. We are doing a screen share to show our slides, so you should be able to see our screen in one of the GoToMeeting windows right now. There should be a slide that says welcome. And lastly, for the housekeeping items, this webinar is being recorded and we plan on posting it later for your review and for those that were from the advisory group that were unable to participate. So I want to say thanks again to all of you for being here. I want to give you an opportunity to quickly introduce yourselves by saying your name and organization. If you don't have audio or prefer to type it in, you can simply use the chat function. And I'm going to start. So I am Josh Simmons with Prosper Sustainably. So somebody else can share their name and organization. If you can just unmute yourself real quick and say it.
Julie Maldonado with the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network.
James Partain, NOAA Regional Climate Services Director for the Alaska region.
Hi everyone, this is Shasta Gahn, Environmental Director for the Paula Band of Mission Indians.
Hello, this is Enrique K. Salt from the University of Arizona College of Pharmacy, and I'm the tribal liaison here.
Kathy Lynn with the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Network.
Hey everyone, Nancy Ruiz, independent contractor.
This is Jonathan Pass, Director of the Global Health Institute of the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
have a couple introductions that came through in the chat window. So we have Victoria Warren Mears, Director of Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. Andrew, I believe that's Lif, I apologize if I got that wrong, on behalf of Ashish Jha, Faculty Director of Harvard Global Health Institute. And again, I apologize for my mispronunciation there. Doug Walker, Programs Director with the Mercy Family Center out of New Orleans. Angelica Greco, I apologize, Angelica, I think I may have got your name wrong there. Public Health Project Coordinator for Climate Ready Tribes Project at the National Indian Health Board. Christina Munja of the Mercy Family Center, I apologize. Michael Piercy, epidemiologist for the Chickasaw Nation. And any other introductions before we move on? And we do have 20 people currently in the room right now, and I think we just had another person join. So, okay, so before moving on to the main purpose of this meeting, I'm going to provide a brief project overview for those that weren't on the last call, and I also want to share some updates on progress that has been made since the last call. Last year, the Paula Band of Mission Indians was awarded a grant from the US EPA for the Tribal Climate Health Project under a solicitation called Building the Capacity of Tribes to Address the Health Impacts of Climate Change. Paula selected, and Shasta Gaughan, the environmental director, is on right now. They had selected Prosper Sustainably to perform the scope of work under the approved grants. The purpose of the Tribal Climate Health Project is to develop resources that will help tribes build capacity to understand and address the health impacts of climate change. The resources include a comprehensive training, resources clearinghouse, tools, templates, and a website to host these resources. The training is a central feature of this project that will help tribal professionals understand the health impacts of climate change and learn about strategies to address those impacts. The training will provide a step-by-step process, several step-by-step processes and tools for conducting health-focused and vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans, as well as offering guidance on how to use an assessment and implement an adaptation plan. After the training is published, we will proceed to the outreach phase of this project. The diagram on your screen right now illustrates the project scope, which includes these capacity building resources and the channels we're going to be using for delivering these resources. So our progress to date includes launching the initial phase of the website tribalclimatehealth.org, along with a beta version of the Resource Clearinghouse. The Resource Clearinghouse is a filterable tool that already includes roughly 400 resources relevant to tribal climate health issues, many of which were suggested by our advisory group members. So thank you for your input. And we are going to be continuing to refine the website and clearinghouse as we move forward. We have also made progress in preparing a preliminary outline for the training curriculum, which is the main purpose of today's call. And with that, I will now turn it over to Angie Hacker of Prosper Sustainably, who has developed most of this outline.
All right, thank you, Josh. And Josh, can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks all for joining us, and I really want to say thank you for your collaboration and help thus far on our first couple of milestones that we've hit. I've had a chance to communicate with quite a few of you and meet a few of you in person, and I just really look forward to learning more from you as we continue. Our goal for this curriculum is really that it can lay the groundwork for a training that is going to be helpful, meaningful, and actionable for tribal communities. And so to accomplish this goal, there's a lot of work to do. The initial outline we sent out is just simply a starting point from which we can incorporate your feedback and continued research that we're working on. Part of the intent of this meeting is to familiarize you, our advisory group members, with our outline. We hope you've had a chance to skim at least what we sent out to you. More importantly, today we're hoping that you're able to provide us with some feedback, and so you'll see at the end of most of these slides are some advisory discussion topics to help us start getting your high-level feedback. And like Josh mentioned, we just have limited time, so I'll ask you to keep your comments brief. And then by the end of this presentation, we're going to provide you with some additional information about how you can provide more feedback, both verbally and in writing, and we'll get into that later. So I'm just going to start really high level. So the training curriculum outline, and if you have that open on your computer, that could be helpful, the Word document that was sent out. It will be a training that will be online, intended to be interactive. It will be split into 5 self-paced modules and an introductory module, which we're calling Module 0. And it's really designed for health, environmental, and other professionals that serve tribes. So as we continue along and talking about the training, just keep in mind it's for the professionals that will serve the tribal members. It isn't a direct training for tribal members. The way that we've organized the training outline, the curriculum outline so far is as follows, as you see on the screen there. Organized at the highest level by module. Like I said, there are 5 of them. The modules each include a description and learning objectives, which we'll go over. The next layer under that will be sections. So each module includes at least 2 sections. Each section will have then multiple lessons. And that's really where the content lies. That's where all of the research and citations and activities and information will lie, is within lessons. And they're intended to be, you know, roughly maybe 10, 15 minutes or so in order to give people a high level information that they can use and then move on. Something easy to use and easy to consume. At the end of every section will be an action step where we're encouraging people to actually do something that moves them along the process of helping them adapt to health and other impacts of climate change. And at the end of every module is a learning assessment, or in other words, a quiz. I'm sorry, I'm not quite done yet. The lesson content is going to be delivered through a mix of formats, subject to resource availability. That just means really we'll have some work ahead of us in terms of producing these videos. And so to the extent we can, we'd actually like to incorporate interviews, you know, go out and go in person to produce some actual video interviews with folks. Otherwise, we'll be using voice-guided animated slides, video clips, and other media. And just a little note here that the content that you see in the original curriculum outline is just preliminary. It's intended to provide you with a preview of the type of information we plan to include once the curriculum is further developed. And so I'm going to pause here and encourage some discussion from the advisory group members on the phone here. And just if you have any input, can you please let us know if the structure can be structure and organization can be more effective, and if so, how? And also, are there ways that we can more effectively deliver that content, and if so, how? So if you can unmute yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, and despite what I said, there is no option to raise your hand, so you will just have to unmute yourself, and we'll just have to, hopefully people won't talk over one another. So if you have any feedback on the structure and organization, or anything else at this moment, please unmute yourself and let us know.
Okay, well, this is administrative so far, and I imagine most of you have your expertise in more of the topical area, so we'll get into that.
This is Jamie from Kenemish. Can you hear?
Oh, yes. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, I just wanted to say I was curious about this section specifically titled the populations of concern. It kind of seemed redundant to me. I think most tribes know they're a population of concern. So I wasn't sure about that. I mean, overall, I think the outline looks good. I was just wondering about why specifically that was in there, if there was a reason.
Oh, yeah. So, Jamie, and actually, we're going to, just so everybody knows, we're going to go into each module. So if you have module-specific input, we can try to address it there, but let me address this one. Populations of concern were one of the several health impact areas that were addressed in the U.S. Global Change Research Project health assessment. So we sort of used that framework throughout this outline, and it isn't necessary that we include populations of concern, but we thought maybe we ought to keep it for now and decide maybe later on there are some components that still may be meaningful. You know, populations of concern are not just Indigenous communities, but children, elderly, outdoor workers, and things like that. So, but I had the same thought that it could be redundant. All right, thank you, Jamie. I'm gonna move to the next slide. And Josh, feel free to stop me if you see something come through on chat. Okay. Okay, so in the beginning, the cover page, you see learning objectives as well. These are the learning objectives that we've come up with, still open for adaptation. So the first is to gain a basic understanding of climate change science and projected impacts. The second is to be able to clearly communicate the linkages between human health and climate change to tribal leaders and other community members. 3 is to have working knowledge of the main climate change health impacts and strategies being used to address them. 4 is to possess knowledge and skills needed to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment in tribal communities with a specific focus on health. And these next 2 are really just following up on that. So the first is a vulnerability assessment. The second is we want them to possess knowledge and skills to then do a climate change adaptation plan. And the next is to be able to basically implement that climate change adaptation plan, again, in tribal communities with a specific focus on health. And really the modules are set up in this order. So learning objective 1 and 2 go with module 1, 3 goes with module 2, and so forth. And so that's really a good preview of the structure of how we're thinking through the organization of this training. And so back to advisory group discussion, do these strike you as appealing for the types of folks that we're going to be reaching, which again is tribal professionals and the organizations that serve tribes? And can learning objectives be improved, and if so, how?
Hi, this is Enrique K. Salt, and I have a question regarding the learning objectives, the ability to clearly communicate climate change to tribal leaders. During that development of the model, are you bringing in tribal community leaders to give their input, because they do have an understanding of climate change that is voiced in their own, either it's language or their own model in their own government system? So I was wondering who developed that, and if they're non-tribal or tribal leaders, and if they're collaborated with to develop that information.
Yeah, so the learning objective here is really saying the training is intended to prepare the professionals that work with tribes to be able to communicate up to the tribal leadership. But I think you're right, and as well as community members. I think you're right that many of them already have their own understanding of climate change, and I will certainly incorporate your feedback here that it's worthwhile as we develop that content to make sure that we are in contact with tribes and tribal leaders, so we get a better understanding of where they are at in their knowledge. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. And then I have another question regarding that. So who will this all be shared with? What areas are they coming from? Is it nationally, certain states?
Oh, this is national, so it's an EPA-funded grant, and it's intended to be national. So as we go through and build out this curriculum, it will be important for us to sort of customize where we can for regions, knowing that there are very diverse impacts.
So how will that be addressed when those professionals who are serving tribal communities, how are they going to know to clearly communicate to the tribal leaders when you have various tribes nationally and it can't all be communicated the same way?
Right. I think we have to do our best here, but trying to understand that the cultures are going to be different, the politics are going to be different, the structure of the communities are going to be different. So what we're doing is trying to take best practices from around the country and tribes that have been successful in doing this, so that we can aggregate up the best information that we can to provide some guidance for the tribes that may need it.
Thank you.
I'd also like to add that we're not necessarily providing like a prescriptive approach. We're trying to cover a broad range of topics, that some of which are not going to apply to different tribes and different regions. And we're going to try to provide a process and steps to be able to, I guess, in effect, kind of identify and select and pinpoint what is most relevant to your community, and and how, what is your process for determining that and acting upon that and disregarding the things that aren't.
Thank you.
So yeah, and that brings up the topic of, reference materials, and a lot of what we're using right now is what we consider to be pretty credible standard materials. Some of the latest stuff coming out of U.S. Global Change Research Program, so and the National Climate Assessment and things like that. So we hope that there's not too much variability in terms of some of just the basic science behind climate change, but we do want to then incorporate as much as we can, and we'll get into that, traditional knowledges that are obviously going to vary from tribe to tribe. Are there any other feedback on this slide? Okay, so at the end of the day, we hope that folks that take this training will feel comfortable and ready to go, and even have made progress towards pulling together their vulnerability assessments, climate change adaptation plans, and then begin implementation. I will mention just briefly too here that this training that we're putting together is meant to be something that folks can come back to as they are making progress through those types of activities, that it will help provide some guidance as they go along. So at their last meeting, we actually went through the planned curriculum modules, and this is just a high-level overview of the modules. So instead of going through this in any detail, what I think I'd like to do is just go through the titles, and then we're going to go through each module one by one. So the first is Introduction and Overview. It'll be followed by a module on understanding climate change and human health, followed by another module on climate change health impacts and strategies. And that will be using a format borrowing the climate health impact areas, those 8 that you see on the right, from the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And then we'll follow up with assessing climate change and health vulnerability, preparing a climate change and health adaptation plan, and then implementing that plan. So we'll go through each module one by one, and for folks that have feedback, we would certainly love to hear it. So module 0 is very basic. That'll be the introduction and overview. Section 1 is just the basic introduction. It's really only one section. Lesson 1 will be a welcome. We're hoping to actually have somebody on camera providing a welcome, and hoping that could be Paula Tribe. Lesson 2 will just be a course overview. So the intent here is just to make sure that people have come to this training or know what it's about and it's the right training for them. Module 0 will end with a pre-assessment, sort of helping us to gather information about how the level of knowledge that people are coming in with. Do a final assessment, we can measure the impact that we have made through this training. Is there any advisory group feedback on this module? I know this one's pretty straightforward and boilerplate, but if you have feedback on structure, or if you've looked any further into the actual outline, the detailed outline, we would certainly be interested in any feedback or recommendations you can provide.
Angie, this is Shasta. I'll just throw out there, as you already know, and people who know me know, Paula will be more than happy to be on video.
Okay. Yep, I figured.
For anything that you want us to do. So just making sure you know that.
Yeah, thank you. We assumed.
Hi, this is Enrique K. Salt again. I do have a question. So I'm new entering the advisory group, and so I had very limited time to look over this from yesterday. And so for the introduction, is there any input on the history of tribal lands, why they are in reservations, or what laws and policies as well as treaties that have been implemented, either they're abide by or not abide by, how it has affected the health of tribal communities? Is there any information on that in the introduction?
There wasn't any yet in the outline. The idea for Module 0, right now at least, was to be more administrative and really just provide a course overview so people knew what was coming. I think there are good places in subsequent modules for that type of information to be placed. And so I'm wondering if you would mind if we talk about that as we go through the other modules and make sure that we have adequately addressed that in the right place.
I'm more than comfortable doing that as we go through this, but just one of my inputs is that is something to be put out there and voiced coming out of the gates, because it's something that's not really known about, especially by Western researchers.
I think that's good input. Okay, so you would suggest putting that up front. Maybe maybe it can be a shorter piece up front and then get into more detail in one of the later modules.
Yeah, and I feel you would see it across over various models when addressing working with tribal members too as well.
Great, thank you, thank you. Any other feedback? Okay. Well, thank you. So we're moving on to Module 1. This module is on understanding climate change and human health. And so really the idea here is to provide a basic primer on the link between climate change and human health, including climate change science and traditional knowledges and the role of public health professionals. And so section 1 is what is climate change and what does it mean for tribal communities? There are 3 lessons under that section. The first is climate change science. Really going over the evidence that is available, the most credible, national evidence that is available in a pretty high level fashion. We don't need for everybody to be climate change scientists, but just enough to know the basics and be able to communicate the basics to their community if they can't already. And lesson 2 will be about climate change in tribal communities. And I actually think this is where some of that information that was just suggested could land, some of the particular and unique impacts that are going to happen to tribal communities, not just the climate impacts themselves, but perhaps the context of those communities and some of their unique characteristics, politics, policies, and structures, and why this is a unique training for them. Lesson 3 will be specific to traditional knowledges and climate change. So, and really we'd like to be very sensitive to this information throughout the rest of the modules and make sure that if we are able to attain traditional knowledges, that we always get consent to use it, if we're going to use it as examples, but really just to encourage those communities. The proposed frameworks we're using encourage communities to use that traditional knowledge, in line and at the same time as some of the Western science that is available. And then at the end there'll be an action step. And section 2, climate change is a public health issue. So in this case, we just want to make sure that for the public health folks that we are going to be reaching, that they really understand their role in climate change. So there'll be an introduction to climate change impacts on human health. That's really just sort of a 101 because module 2, the next module, is going to go into that in a lot of detail. Lesson 2 is on climate change health impacts in tribal communities. So again, what's specific to tribal communities about health impacts, not just climate change and climate change science. And 3 is the role of public health professionals in climate change. And there's some really good reference materials and resources on that that are broader than just tribal communities, but I think are very applicable as well. And then there'll be a learning assessment. And so that's our high level thoughts right now, and certainly open to feedback and input on what what is missing, what could be adapted, what should be removed. And if you have looked further at the outline, the detailed outline, if you want to provide any more detailed input on, the initial topics that we're going to be reviewing or activities. And certainly we would love to hear if you have, say you know a lot about this topic and you say, have you seen this resource? We would love for you to suggest resources, more reference materials for us, case studies and that type of thing. So anybody can unmute themselves and provide some input, that would be great.
This is Jamie from Swinomish. I'm just starting to go through it. I think I'm on page 34 or something. But one of the things that I really noticed was that it is very much, one, geared towards urban areas, and two, geared towards public health professionals. Most tribes aren't in urban areas, and so I would really think about reassessing that piece. Like, for instance, there's some discussion about transportation and regional plans and the fleet of the tribe. But, I think adding things about boats and diesel change out and snowmobiles, and just recognizing that most tribes maybe aren't urban, they're rural and they have very different ideas, and also that most tribes don't have public health departments. There are very few that are accredited. Some tribes don't even have health clinics. And so I think increasing this to, most tribes do have at least one person who works in a natural resources department, whatever it may be called. And they're more than likely the folks that will be looking at this because they've been tasked to write a climate change and impact assessment and a vulnerability assessment and action plan, and they need to include health. So I think making it broader in that way, and also just the fact that most tribes don't define health as separate from the environment, I think making it broader than just the health department will be really important.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I think your input's going to be really important throughout. So for folks that don't know, Swinomish is actually a leader here. They're part of the National Indian Health Board's Climate Ready Tribes program and have had a vulnerability assessment, impact assessment done since 2009. And so we're going to learn a lot from tribes that are far ahead in the process and certainly use their best practices and insights and wisdom. Are there others that would like to share some feedback?
This is Enrique K again. Some feedback is when developing and introducing these all is utilizing various professional backgrounds aside from public health and science would also be the Environmental Protection Department of the tribe, their own health department as well too. So that's some input too as well. Or whether it be waste management, air quality department, water quality department, just so you have various perspectives honing in, so you get those various point of views because they do come from the community and have valuable input.
Maybe on lesson 3, instead of just the role of public health professionals, we're talking about the role of all types of professionals, but the focus still being at this point on health. At least that's what the grant was interested in us making sure we were focused on. So we'll have to find the right way to talk about that.
Maybe there can be a model of Indigenous practice of where it's not really just categorized in the Department of Health, but what incorporates health are all those categories of air, water, waste management, public health, and so on.
That's great. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that input. Is there anybody else?
This is Jamie at Swinomish again. I just had one question. I looked up the the Global Change, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, Climate and Health Assessment, and there's only a page and a half that are specific to Indigenous peoples, but there are 4 sections in there. There are a couple of sections in there that we wanted to ensure really stood out because they really weren't highlighted in the main 8 sections. And I would suggest thinking about them as either replacements for what's currently in there or additions. Like for instance, you have food security, or food safety, but thinking about it as food security and safety, I think is the broader picture, and it's not just foods, but about medicines as well. Water security, not just water, but water security. Loss of cultural identity was one that we put in there. Not, that's in addition to mental health. And then degraded infrastructure and other impacts was another section in there, and with lots of good sites of current research and case studies that are going on.
Thank you. Yes, we'll want to look more closely at that. Are there others? Okay, I'm going to move on to Module 2. And I'll just reiterate, there are more opportunities to provide input as well if you're not quite ready to yet. So we appreciate you being on board and getting familiar with the process. So Module 2, Climate Change Health Impacts and Strategies. Like I said, this is going to intended to follow those health impact areas. So temperature, air quality, extreme events, vector-borne diseases, water, food, mental health, and populations of concern as a framework, because it's fairly well established, but I think there are opportunities to adapt that specifically to Indigenous communities because it wasn't built specifically for Indigenous communities. And so the organization is section 1 is just on temperature. So for each section in this module, it's a section on each of those health impact areas. This is an example. So lesson 1 would just be an overview of temperature-related health impacts, and that would include a nice chart that talks about climate drivers, exposures, and outcomes, health outcomes. Lesson 2 is temperature-related health impacts on tribal communities. So what specific health impacts are being experienced by tribal communities, or concerns, or traditional knowledge, what's specific to tribal communities. Lesson 3, temperature-related climate health indicators. This is going to require some work. Right now, I have sort of high-level thoughts about what kind of traditional knowledges and observations can be included along with medical records and other climate indicators, and I'm mining it from a lot of different sources, including what I'm seeing come out of tribal adaptation plans. And Swinomish is certainly going to be helpful here because they've created their own health indicators, Indigenous health indicators. And so we have a lot to learn here, and certainly would like to receive as much information as we can from our advisory group members as to what climate health indicators are useful. And then we'll have a section on strategies to address, in this case, tribal-related health impacts. And so that's us doing the same kind of thing, mining for best practices and what's been effective in tribal and non-tribal communities in terms of strategies that can help overcome some of the impacts of temperature-related health impacts. And so we're actually going to be creating an inventory of those strategies, but each of these sections will include the relevant health impact area strategies. Lesson 5 will be a tribal case study. So this is actually a big area that we'll need some help with, is finding a really good example of a tribe that's gone through maybe a temperature-related problems in their community, and perhaps has come through a process by which they've found an adaptation strategy that's worked, or at least had some lessons learned. And then there'll be an action step. And then from there, we go through air quality and extreme events, and we'll go through all of them. And at the end will be a learning assessment. So again, back to the advisory group discussion. Any input on structure or organization, or if you've looked more detailed, any type of feedback on the content or recommendations for further information.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Gerald. I was wondering, on the data that would be used, and especially when you're dealing directly with the data coming out of Native communities, are you guys working through the group at the colleges to get a release of that information?
Well, we probably won't, you know, unless we're on a tribal case study or providing specific examples, we're not probably going to be releasing, you know, sensitive data from any specific tribe. I think what we'll mainly be doing is pointing to high-level indicators, meaning like types of metrics or types of data that we would encourage tribes to be gathering and monitoring in their communities. And then we will also be encouraging folks to, you know, go to the resources, go to the sources of that data. So part of what we're doing is finding those databases and finding, you know, the university research centers and places that actually can provide data for folks in a little bit more efficient manner, so not everybody has to be collecting all of it all the time.
And just to add to that, that will be more integrated into the parts where we go through steps of doing the vulnerability assessment and developing the adaptation plan. We'll be offering, you know, different, not just steps for pursuing that data, but also, you know, these sources we're able to identify and that you all will hopefully help us identify that are out there, from, you know, higher level national databases to regional and local databases and sources of information and technical assistance as well.
But I hear, I think the point being, you know, maybe to be cautious about making sure that we have rights to using certain information and data. So that's well taken. Any other feedback here? Okay, and Josh, are you monitoring the chat function?
Yes, I have been.
Let me just see, I think, all right, making sure I didn't get any specific. All right, let's move on to the next module. I'm sorry, I think I went backwards. All right, module 3. So this is now, you know, hopefully by this point, folks have a really solid understanding of climate change and health impacts, and some idea of the types of ways that you can measure those health impacts, climate and health impacts, and some strategies that folks have used to overcome some of those health impacts or to prepare for them. Now in module 3, we're talking about outlining an approach that tribes can use to conduct a climate change vulnerability assessment. And so we're pulling from many different credible approaches, a lot of them tribal, not all of them, because one of the struggles in this process is there are some really good examples of materials that incorporate climate change and, you know, adaptation, health, and tribal communities. But a lot of them maybe only you know, address one or two of those three really important pieces. So we're having to kind of cobble some things together. So we're really interested in folks' advice about this section, and actually all the sections, but this one in particular, because we're going to be providing a proposed framework and steps for how to actually conduct a climate change and health vulnerability assessment. Section 1 is more of a high-level overview. So it's about addressing tribal climate health. Starts with a vulnerability assessment, and so it'll provide lesson 1, an overview, lesson 2, assessment, including things like, you know, assessing your internal capacity and things like that. And that's actually lesson 2. And lesson 3 is vulnerability assessment approaches. And so that will be an overview of all the different types of ways that vulnerability assessments are done, taking into account that some are really risk and hazard based, some are more strength based. And we certainly are going to tap into the BRACE framework, the CDC's BRACE framework, which is a 5-step continuum of vulnerability and adaptation. And I know that there have been efforts to indigenize the BRACE model, and so we're incorporating those types of advancements. Certainly interested in folks on this on the call and other advisory members to learn what other types of approaches we should be incorporating. One of the messages we'd like to send here is there isn't a right size or one size fits all approach. All of these assessments and plans are going to have to be customized for that particular community, but we're going to try to provide some high-level guidance. Section 2 is that high-level guidance, so it's conducting a tribal climate health vulnerability assessment. Lesson 1 is a framework that focuses on tribal climate health, and it actually provides what will end up being sort of a template for really the outline of what a tribal climate health vulnerability assessment could look like. I think we could spend quite a bit of time on that, and so in future, and we're going to go over sort of next steps, how we're going to collect more input. We're going to want to spend some time with folks on getting that right. Lesson 2 feeds off of lesson 1, and basically, okay, if that's the outline, what steps do you go about to conduct that vulnerability assessment to result in the at the end of the day into a report that can be taken to tribal leaders. Lesson 3 goes through each of those steps one by one. Step 1 being determine objectives and scope. Lesson 4 is step 2, gather relevant data and expertise. Lesson 5, step 3 is assess components of vulnerability. Lesson 6, step 4 is identify and prioritize most significant vulnerabilities and strengths. And lesson 7 is step 5, which is synthesizing the results in an assessment report. And that's just really a high-level window into the steps that we would suggest at this point based on the research we've done so far, which is preliminary. We want to have a section here or a lesson here on collaborative approaches to assessing vulnerabilities, because we have in our research found that there are quite a few tribal communities that are finding benefit in working together with regional consortiums to conduct vulnerability together. And then it will end up with a tribal case study, an action step, and a learning assessment. Okay, so that was quick, but if anybody has any high-level feedback for us at this point, we would certainly appreciate it. And like I said, there's more opportunities to come. Okay. Well, I think folks are probably feeling what I'm feeling, which is this is a big topic. It's going to require some a little bit more back and forth. And like I said, there's opportunity for that. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Module 4, preparing a climate change adaptation plan. This is using a very similar structure as Module 3, but it's now assuming that a vulnerability assessment has been done, you know, that the tribal leadership wants to move on to an adaptation plan, which is basically saying, okay, now we know what the risks are. Let's create some strategies and solutions to overcome those risks or to prepare for those risks. Section 1 being an adaptation planning is a critical step in addressing tribal climate health. And there's 3 lessons. First is an overview, second is approaches, and third is preparing to conduct an adaptation plan. I think on the last slide, I just had those turned around. And so that's sort of the prep for actually conducting a tribal climate health adaptation plan, which is the next section. Lesson 1, again, the same structure is providing a proposed framework that focuses on tribal climate health. So that's going to be, again, an outline or a template for what the end result report could actually look like. And lesson 2 through 7 are really just the steps in the planning process to arrive at that tribal climate health adaptation plan. So step 1 is, you know, these are similar. Step 1, again, you're going to determine your objectives and scope of your adaptation plan. Step 2, being reviewing the vulnerability assessment priorities that you've already done and establish adaptation goals. Step 3, identify and prioritize potential adaptation strategies to reduce vulnerability and risk. Step 4, organize selected strategies into an action plan. And then 5 is synthesizing those results into an adaptation plan. And again, ending with a tribal case study, hopefully some, you know, working with some folks that have gone through this process and have some good lessons learned, and then action step and a learning assessment. So I'd like to open it up again for some advisory group discussion, and I realize that there's a lot to discuss here, but if you have any high-level feedback, we'd appreciate it. And maybe anybody out there who's sort of had experience going through tribal or non-tribal vulnerability and adaptation planning processes through these. You know, if you could let us know if we're missing a major step, or if you would point us in the direction of a really good resource that could help change our thinking about this. Okay, well, I think we'll get into that as we go along in the next couple of months. So this is the last module, and pretty hopefully intuitive. It's next to talk about implementing a climate change and health adaptation plan. So this is assuming that an adaptation plan was conducted and the tribal leadership wants to move on to implementation. And so it'll give some advice about moving from planning to implementation in the first section. Lesson 1 being take action. You know, really just talking about making that transition from planning to implementation. Lesson 2 goes into more detail about implementation management and resources. So how to actually you know, set up your management structures so that you can have an actionable implementation of your plan. And so, you know, you're not really done at the point when your adaptation plan is complete. We really want to make sure that that adaptation plan doesn't just sit on the shelf, but there is an implementation plan that follows it, and, you know, sort of a work plan that folks can then move on to being, you know, going through the milestones, understanding who's responsible, understanding where the resources are coming from. Lesson 3 is on communication, outreach, and collaboration. So, and this will be a theme throughout, not just here, but this is another opportunity to talk about how important it is to work closely with your community to really understand and get collaboration with community members that can assist with community members and tribal leaders that can assist with implementation, and other partner agencies. Section 2 is a continuous improvement approach to tribal climate health adaptation. And so this is just really a reminder to, even if you have completed implementation, you're not done. Of course, that last step of BRACE, and most implementation processes encourage continued evaluation, monitoring, and updates to these plans. So lesson 1 is just about adaptation is ongoing. Lesson 2 will provide guidance on evaluating progress and performance. Lesson 3 is about staying accountable to an adaptation plan. So basically, how can you set it up so that you're reporting regularly on your progress to your community. Updating an adaptation plan is an important step to keep it updated and relevant with latest projections and you know, based on how much adaptation work has been completed. And lesson 5 being sharing your community story, really for the benefit of all the other tribes and communities that can benefit from hearing what you've done. There'll be an action step and a learning assessment. So that would be the end of the module, and at the end of this module, you know, that learning assessment will help us track the knowledge gained throughout the entire training. Are there input at this? Is there input at this point that anybody's willing to share? Okay. Well, that was a lot to take in. So let's talk about some next steps and how we're going to actually use your input. So here's where we're going to go from here. Interesting. Okay. So January, this month, you had received an initial outline to review. We're having this meeting, and the next step will be to actually provide us some feedback. We've created a form that you had received. It's a Google form, and it includes similar questions as we went through today, that gives you an opportunity to spend more time thinking through how you would actually provide feedback on each of the modules and some of the general topics. And so each month, we kind of want to go through a similar process, but for different modules. So each month, we'd like to go through, in the early months, you'll receive a draft curriculum. By mid-month, you'll have an opportunity to participate in a review meeting where we can go into more detail on each module. And then by late month, we would hope for some written feedback if you had any. And so February would be module 1, March would be module 2, April module 3, May would be module 4, and June would be module 5. And so we really want to be cautious because we know everybody here is busy, has their own job. And so what we want to do in that form that you'll receive is we're asking folks to tell us where their interest lies. If they have the most interest and expertise and experience in vulnerability assessments, maybe let us know that that's an area where you'd like to see more involved in review and development of curriculum, if you can. And so those are really the next steps. So let me just go through the next activities and we'll finish up with any final Q&A. So we're asking for folks, aside from the input we received today, thank you so much for that, and I know we received more over chat. Please complete the online review form that we sent out on Monday. It's intended to be brief. It's not intended for you to spend a ton of time. This is just the first layer of review. But in that, please do indicate your interest in particular modules. We're going to use that to spend more time with the folks that are interested in those modules. Everybody will be invited to subsequent review meetings, but we're assuming that people that volunteer will have a particular interest in helping us a little bit. And so with that, that's really the next steps. We're going to follow up this meeting by sending out the recording and the instructions on how to provide that feedback again. And I'd like to just say thank you again for your early feedback and for participating, and we hope you'll continue along with us. This is a really, we think, important topic, and we really want to get it right. We think we need your help to do that. And so any final questions and answers for the last couple minutes? Josh, do you have any final words, or Shasta, any closing thoughts?
I think that we are making good progress here. So thank you, Angie and Josh, for what you've done so far. Enrique, I really appreciated your feedback as well. You're right that it's important that we make sure we include a broader tribal, cultural, and historic context to this. And I would love to be a part of that along with you or anybody else. And also just that I know that these are difficult types of meetings to participate in when you don't really know whether you should jump in or this or that, but I'm really hoping to get some good feedback from the rest of you on the written materials that are being sent out, and feel free to do that too, send out an email or mark up a copy and send that out with your comments if that's easier for you than raising your hand or unmuting yourself on these calls. But thank you everybody for participating.
Thank you, Shasta. And I just want to say too, the feedback we received through a couple emails we received ahead of time and in the prior advisory group meeting, and even just what people spoke up and said today initially was, I think, was all extremely valuable feedback. I think it's going to be a lot easier to provide feedback as we get into the details and we start fleshing out the curriculum for this outline. I think as we proceed and as those from the advisory group express interest in particular modules, lessons, and topics, we'll probably try to reach out even individually to, through phone calls and maybe smaller group meetings as well, so we can, I think, more focus on something and just we're at such a high level and covering so much that it can be challenging to provide really meaningful feedback, and especially in such a short period of time. So we're going to continue to provide different options for you to provide feedback, and if you can even, if you come up with different ideas of how you feel like it'd be best to offer others to provide feedback or, you know, just listen to feedback, you know, let us know about that as well. So, but we very much appreciate the time that you all have taken today to join us, and we're just really excited. We've had a good turnout here today. We've had a lot of good emails back and forth. We had a lot more people actually signed up to join and probably weren't able to for one reason or another this particular call. And so we're just, you know, excited to continue moving forward and seeing what we come up with along the way. And thank you, Angie, for all of your work.
If I may, real quick, hello, Shasta. It's good hearing from you as well. Is there any process in here that we may also incorporate to stress including youth as well as elders, to develop that cultural appropriation and make sure everything's appropriate for the community, but also bringing in the youth, such as interns working for whatever professionals are serving tribal communities, but that also addresses capacity building, because you're teaching community members to utilize those skills and they can carry that on in their tribe and kind of discontinue that dependency for using those outside resources and start strengthening themselves internally.
I think that's great feedback, and it was certainly part of the original proposal for this project. Maybe we can talk a little bit offline with you and get a little bit more of your thoughts on that and where that would be appropriate and useful.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your time and look forward to working with you further.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.